The Question of Responsibility, Jarmo Palamaki. Chapter 1. The House of Longbourn, usually a place of cheerful, if sometimes noisy, mediocrity, was plunged into a silence more profound than any winter snow. The abruptness of the event had stunned them into immobility. It had happened during the second course. Mr. Bennet, who had just delivered a dry observation upon the impropriety of Kitty's posture, had suddenly paused, his hand lifting spasmodically to his temple, before he slid slowly, terrifyingly, from his chair. Now, hours later, the dining room had been cleared, and the family was assembled in the drawing room, waiting. The apothecary, Mr. Jones, a man of limited knowledge but considerable gravity, had been closeted in Mr. Bennet's dressing room for a length of time that stretched Mrs. Bennet's nerves past the point of endurance. When Mr. Jones finally entered the drawing room, the scent of volatile salts preceding him, he found the 6 women of the family awaiting his verdict. Jane was pale and steady, her arm linked with Mrs. Bennet's, who was trembling violently. Elizabeth stood slightly apart, her expression a mask of dreadful anticipation, fearing the diagnosis yet desperate for a shred of hope. Mr. Jones cleared his throat, adjusting the spectacles on his nose. "Madam," he addressed Mrs. Bennet, his voice low and professional, "the situation is exceedingly grave." Mrs. Bennet emitted a strangled sob. "Is he feverish? Can we bleed him?" "Say he will be well, Mr. Jones. I regret to inform you, madam, that it is not a fever of the spirits. It is, I believe, what the practitioners term a severe seizure, an affliction of apoplexy. A stroke, the word hung in the air, heavy and fatal. Mr. Bennet is unconscious," the apothecary continued, delivering the information with professional detachment. "And regrettably, the entire right side is paralyzed. The seizure was profound. I have done all that is permissible, but I must be honest. The chances of a full recovery, or even a regaining of consciousness, are very slender indeed." The room fragmented into individual expressions of despair. Jane wept silently into her handkerchief. Mary stared blankly ahead, absorbing the calamity abstractly. But it was Mrs. Bennet who broke the decorum first. "Unconscious? Paralysis? Oh, the cruelty of it! What is to become of us?" Her voice rose to a hysterical shriek that had little to do with affection and everything to do with fear. If he dies, we are ruined. Longbourn, the house will be Mr. Collins." The shriek of Longbourn was the true dagger. It was the material consequence of the tragedy, far exceeding the initial physical shock. Mr. Bennet, witty, ironic, and often detached, was now revealed as the fragile linchpin holding their entire existence together. If he expired, the entailment meant they would lose their home, their income, and their respectable position in Hertfordshire society. For Elizabeth, the news struck with a sickening double force. She felt the immediate, rending grief for her father, her confidant, her greatest admirer, the one person who truly understood her quick mind and unconventional spirit. To know that his dry wit, his comforting presence might already be gone, leaving behind only an inert shell, was unbearable. She pushed past her mother, her eyes locked on Mr. Jones. "Is there truly nothing, sir? No treatment that might recall him?" "Miss Bennet," the apothecary said gently, recognizing the desperate plea, "we must prepare for the worst. The damage is done. It is now a matter of waiting." Elizabeth retreated to the window alcove, leaning her forehead against the cool glass. The paralysis felt like a physical weight pressing on her own chest. Her father's death had always been a distant, abstract horror, something belonging to the realm of tragic novels. Now it was a very real, immediate financial catastrophe, threatening to cast 5 penniless, single women upon the dubious mercy of their relations. The entailment, which she and her father had often joked about with cynical amusement, was no longer funny. It was a monstrous, ancient mechanism grinding toward them. She remembered the last conversation they had shared at length, a discussion about the foolishness of Mr. Collins's most recent letter. Her father had been chuckling. Now that sound was silent, and the heir who represented their ruin might soon possess the very rooms where that laughter had resided. A sudden sharp guilt pierced through her grief. She had loved his company, but how often had she truly cared for his well-being? How often had she taken his health and presence for granted, relying on the constancy of his affectionate approval? When Mrs. Bennet's sobs finally subsided into weary sniffles, Elizabeth knew she could not afford the luxury of despair. Jane was already occupied tending to their mother. Mary, Kitty, and Lydia were useless, huddled together in tearful fear. The responsibility, the dreadful necessity of practicality fell to her. She looked toward the closed door of her father's room. Her beloved father lay behind it, suspended between worlds, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to help them. Elizabeth Bennet, who valued independence and strength above all else, felt a crushing loneliness settle upon her. She was adrift in a cold sea of contingency, gazing at the swift current that would soon sweep them all away from Longbourn, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. The favored daughter of Mr. Bennet was now the only one capable of facing the unyielding future. And that future, if her father did not miraculously rally, was currently owned entirely by Mr. Collins. Chapter 2. The clock on the mantelpiece in Mr. Bennet's study ticked with a gruesome slowness, marking the passage of time, not in minutes, but in descending degrees of hope. Elizabeth sat stiffly in her father's leather armchair, a position she had no right to occupy, watching the pale, immobile figure in the adjoining bedroom. How different, how impossibly distant, their situation had been only last night. Now Mr. Bennet lay unconscious, struck down by a sudden violent apoplexy. Elizabeth pressed her cold fingers to her temples, trying to force the scene of the ball back into her mind, seeking an anchor in the bright memory before it, too, dissolved into dust. Last night, the Netherfield ball had been a blaze of light and promise. She recalled the joyous clatter of the arriving carriages, the murmur of anticipation, the sight of Jane, radiantly beautiful, standing near the punch bowl, and then there was the arrival of the newcomers. Mr. Bingley. He had burst into the room like sunshine, all pleasant manners and unpretentious good humor, and his eyes had immediately, unequivocally, settled upon Jane. He had danced with her twice, a mark of distinct attention, and had inquired about her complexion, her health, and the distance she had traveled. He was a man of 5,000 a year, unattached, and clearly wonderfully struck. That attention, Elizabeth knew, had been the salvation they had long prayed for, a clear path to securing Jane's future, and by extension, a safety net for the rest of them. But that was before. That was when they were the respected Bennets of Longbourn, minor gentry of comfortable, if precarious, standing. But what about now? The shadow of poverty had fallen so swiftly, like the final drop of the guillotine. Elizabeth could almost hear the rustle of the solicitor's papers, the cold calculation. The moment her father died, her mother and 5 daughters would be practically penniless. Would Bingley still be interested? She whispered into the oppressive quiet of the study. This was the paramount, wretched question. Mr. Bingley seemed a man of genuine warmth, free from the excessive pride often found in gentlemen of his fortune. But even the kindest heart was governed by society's rules. To marry Jane now was not simply to secure a wife. It was to take on the burden of a deeply unfortunate, impoverished family, a family whose name would soon be associated only with tragedy and lack of provision. Their entire destiny hung on the fragile thread of Bingley's infatuation. If he withdrew, influenced perhaps by the practical counsel of his sisters, or the cold logic of his proud friend Mr. Darcy, then they were truly ruined. Jane, bless her sweet, trusting nature, would likely sink into quiet despair, unable to countenance the loss of a respectable position. Mrs. Bennet would descend into hysterics that would consume their remaining funds. Lydia and Kitty would be forced into situations too dreadful to contemplate. Elizabeth realized with stinging clarity that the time for clever banter and principled disdain was over. She was no longer a girl of 20 years, secure in her father's home, reserving her wit for those who met her exacting standards. She was a woman facing immediate, catastrophic necessity. So, she looked towards the window, where the gray morning light promised nothing but a bleak, cold day. A sudden, terrible resolution solidified within her. If Bingley failed them, she needed to secure a different anchor, and there was only one possibility, however repugnant it might be to her spirit. Mr. Darcy. She recalled his haughty silence at the Meryton Assembly, the curl of his lip, his deliberate insult when he refused to dance with her. She had hated him instantly, finding his pride intolerable. She had hoped never to converse with him again. Yet he had 6 times Bingley's income. He was influential, deeply connected, and possessed of immense, undeniable wealth. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She had rejoiced in his condescension, proud of her independence. Now she found herself praying for its absence. Last night during the Netherfield ball, against all expectations, he had asked her for a dance, and Elizabeth had been so astonished that she had accepted. Why would he ask her, but no one else? It had been a sign for some interest on Darcy's side. If he were to propose, however unlikely, however cold the terms, Elizabeth knew she would accept him. Not for love, not for admiration, but for the sheer, brutal necessity of keeping 5 women from starvation. She would trade her vibrant independence, her spirited joy, and the sacred freedom of her own mind for the heavy chains of Pemberley, if it meant her mother would have a home, and her sisters would be saved from the fate of penniless gentlewomen. The thought was a crushing weight. She would have to swallow her resentment, bridle her tongue, and marry the man she despised, all because her father had been so cruelly laid low. Elizabeth rose from the chair, the sound of the leather protesting the movement. She walked to the doorway of the bedroom, watching her father's fixed, shallow breathing. It was done. The fate of the Bennets was no longer a matter of witty conversation or social maneuvering. It was a race against time, a desperate gamble where the price of losing was absolute ruin. She was ready to use any means, even the hateful Mr. Darcy, to win. If he asks, she whispered, her voice husky with despair and newfound resolve, I shall say yes. Chapter 3. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling faintly of damp earth. Inside Longbourn, however, the air was thick with a different kind of cloud, one of worry and hushed concern. Mr. Bennet, struck down by a sudden apoplexy the previous evening, lay still and frail in his bed, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed against the light. The morning brought unexpected visitors. Mr. Bingley, ever the picture of amiable sympathy, and his friend Mr. Darcy, his countenance a mask of polite gravity, were shown into the drawing-room. Their purpose was to offer condolences, to express their sorrow at the news of Mr. Bennet's alarming illness. We were so concerned to hear of Mr. Bennet's sudden indisposition, Mr. Bingley began, his voice gentle, his brow furrowed with genuine distress. We do hope he will make a recovery, though we understand the gravity of the situation. Mr. Darcy inclined his head, his expression unreadable to anyone but those who knew him intimately. Indeed, he said, his voice a low rumble, a most unfortunate turn of events. We have heard that the physicians hold out little hope. Elizabeth, who had been hovering near the doorway, ostensibly to fetch more tea, found herself frozen. She had been discreetly observing the visitors, a knot of mingled anxiety and resentment tightening in her chest. Her father's illness was a crushing blow, but the arrival of these men, particularly Darcy, felt like an intrusion into their private grief. As they spoke, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the old house, Elizabeth drifted towards the window, pretending to admire the newly washed garden. She could hear their low murmurs, their hushed tones of conversation. Then Darcy's voice, distinct and carrying an edge of detached observation, reached her. It is a tragedy for Mr. Bennet, of course, he said, his tone devoid of any personal warmth. But it is also unfortunate for his daughters. Their prospects, which were already precarious, must now be considered considerably diminished. Any suitor would understand that in case of a marriage, his duty would be to take care of the whole family. The words struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. diminished prospects. The chillingly practical assessment, delivered with such cold logic, ignited a fire within her. This man, this proud, arrogant man, saw her and her sisters merely as pawns on a chessboard of social standing and advantageous marriages. He saw their father's illness not as a human tragedy, but as a strategic disadvantage. Disdain, sharp and bitter, flooded her. How dare he? How dare he reduce their family's pain to a calculation of their marriageability? Had he no concept of genuine feeling? Of compassion beyond the superficial courtesies? He had already displayed his dislike of her spirited nature, his condescending gaze a constant irritant. Now this, anger hot and righteous, surged through her. She imagined confronting him, her voice ringing with indignation, demanding to know how he could be so heartless. But she knew Darcy. He would likely meet her outburst with his usual cool indifference, perhaps even a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. Instead, she turned away from the window, her jaw set. The sympathy of Mr. Bingley, however well-intentioned, was overshadowed by the icy pronouncement of Mr. Darcy. It solidified her existing dislike into a deep-seated animosity. She would not forget his callous words. They would serve as a constant reminder of his character, a character she now despised with every fiber of her being. As Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy rose to take their leave, Elizabeth offered a polite, cool nod, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond them, her mind already hardening against the man who saw only diminished prospects where she saw only profound personal loss. Chapter 4. The news arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, sickening confirmation of fears that had begun to germinate the moment the gentleman had first departed. The morning at Longbourn was leaden. The air in the breakfast parlor was heavy with the smell of stale tea and Mrs. Bennet's voluminous grief. "Gone!" she wailed, striking the table with a trembling hand, causing the silver spoons to rattle. "The whole party, and not a single word of returning. We are ruined, perfectly ruined. My poor Jane to be so used. They are monsters of ingratitude, and it will be the death of me. I assure you, it will." The letter, delivered earlier by a footman from Netherfield, was from Caroline Bingley, written with a chilling lightness. It spoke of the sudden necessity of their moving to London for the season, the difficulty of the journey, and the certainty that Mr. Bingley would be too occupied by his London appointments to return to Hertfordshire for a very long time, perhaps never. She finished with a saccharine promise to write to Jane soon, which Jane knew meant never at all. Jane sat pale and composed, yet her eyes held a wounded, bewildered look that mirrored the gray day outside. She tried, as ever, to put the best possible construction upon the facts. "Indeed, Mamma, we must not jump to conclusions," she said softly, though her voice lacked its usual steady conviction. "Miss Bingley says only that they cannot return soon. Perhaps Mr. Bingley truly has urgent business. It would be entirely unlike his character to deceive." "His character!" cried Mrs. Bennet, tearing a handkerchief into fragments. "What is character to an heiress's fortune, I ask you? They have discovered, I suppose, that our poor estate is not worth the caring for, and have abandoned us to starvation." Elizabeth listened to the clamor of her mother and her younger sisters with a heavy internal stillness. She did not look at the letter. She did not need to. She looked instead at Jane, her sweet, guileless sister, and felt a chilling certainty take hold of her. This was not the accidental, indifferent neglect of a busy gentleman. This was the deliberate, sharp removal engineered by a proud and powerful hand. Mr. Bingley was too amiable, too genuinely attached to Jane, to have abandoned her without a visible struggle or an imminent cause. He would never have left without a personal farewell, much less allowed his sister to write such a dismissive letter, unless he had been utterly convinced of the necessity of his departure and the impropriety of his attachment. And who was capable of such cold, calculated intervention? Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Darcy." She saw it all now with the dreadful clarity of hindsight. She recalled the repeated disdain in his countenance when he observed the family, the way he had separated Bingley from her sister at the Meryton assembly, the pointed severity of his observations regarding the suitability of company. She recalled the long, confidential meetings between the two gentlemen and the sudden heightened seriousness in Mr. Darcy's manner during their last interaction. He had judged Jane as too poorly connected, too inferior in fortune, and her family as insufferable and mortifying. He had seen the genuine affection between his friend and her sister, and had used the power of his influence, his superior judgment, and his immense pride to tear them apart. A deep sense of violation welled up in Elizabeth. She had always prided herself on her perception, her ability to see past flattery and foolishness. She had viewed Mr. Darcy as a mere social spectacle, a fascinating, irritating study in hauteur, whose arrogance she could scorn with impunity. But she had gravely underestimated the dangerous reach of his pride. She had thought his opinions were merely tiresome. She now realized they were weapons. He had acted not only to protect his friend from a supposed inconvenience, but to preserve the purity of his own exclusive circle. Elizabeth stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, drawing a brief, irritated glance from Mrs. Bennet. She walked to the window, staring out at the sodden lawn. Desperation. It was a sour taste in her mouth. It was not the desperation of fearing poverty, but the desperate recognition of her own powerlessness. Her pride, her wit, her sharp tongue, all the defenses she cherished, were utterly useless against the structured, impersonal malice of the aristocratic class. Mr. Darcy had simply decided that the Bennets were unworthy of his friend, and so with a few well-chosen words whispered into the ear of the malleable Mr. Bingley, he had destroyed Jane's happiness and cast a shadow over their entire family's future. She returned to Jane, leaning over her chair, her voice low and tense. Jane, you must not deceive yourself. This is not the error of good intentions. This is imposition, and I know who is to blame. Jane looked up, her expression pleading. Lizzie, please do not attribute malice where thoughtlessness may suffice. Mr. Bingley is gone. We must endure it. Thoughtlessness would mean forgetting to write, Jane, not removing himself entirely to another city under the pretense of business he never mentioned before. This is the work of Mr. Darcy. He is the only one with the requisite pride and the necessary influence. He saw how Bingley admired you, and he decided that you were not good enough for his friend. The accusation, spoken aloud, felt like a bitter truth. Elizabeth felt her own heart hardening, her earlier amusement at Darcy's arrogance replaced by a consuming resentment. He had succeeded utterly. He had played the dutiful, haughty friend, and in doing so had robbed Jane of her joy and secured his friend's permanent withdrawal. The realization brought a wave of true despair. Not only had they lost Bingley, but the source of the loss was an enemy so arrogant and so wealthy that he was entirely beyond their reach. Mr. Darcy would take care that Mr. Bingley remained in London, surrounded by more suitable matches, and entirely convinced that Jane had never truly cared for him. Elizabeth looked at the window again, feeling the weight of the city, of power, of wealth, pressing down on the small, isolated dignity of Longbourn. He is a wretch, she whispered, her hands clenched at her sides. A thoroughly, unforgivably proud wretch. And he has won. Chapter 5. The faint light of dawn, a pale gray wash against the rain-streaked window panes of her room, did little to alleviate the suffocating gloom that clung to Elizabeth Bennet. Longbourn, usually alive with the rustle of silks, the cheerful chatter of her sisters, and the booming pronouncements of her father, felt eerily silent, a tomb of whispered anxieties. Elizabeth paced the worn Aubusson carpet, her customary vivacity replaced by a raw, gnawing desperation. Anger, a hot, bitter tide, surged within her, demanding an outlet, a target. Who, she thought, her voice a low growl in the stillness, was to blame for this precipice upon which their family teetered? Her mind, sharp and analytical, even in its turmoil, darted through possibilities. Could she blame Mr. Darcy? The thought was met with an immediate, almost instinctive recoil. Absurd, she muttered, the word tasting like ash. To blame him for his pride, for his conscious refusal to engage with a family he deemed beneath his consequence? It was entirely within his character, yet it felt too simplistic, too easy a scapegoat for the intricate tapestry of their misfortune. He was a consequence, not a cause. Then there was Mr. Bingley. Her heart ached for his gentle nature, his susceptibility to the opinions of others. Could she blame him for his dependence on his friends, for his lack of self-assurance that had led him to abandon Jane, to break her heart, and by extension, contribute to this present despair? But even as the thought formed, it crumbled. If that was his weakness, a flaw in his very being, how could she truly hold him accountable? It was like blaming a reed for bending in the wind. Her gaze fell upon the heavy oak door, a silent sentinel guarding the rest of the house, and her thoughts turned to her father. Should she blame him for not having been better prepared, for not having secured their future with more foresight? The image of him, broken and unresponsive in his sick room, a victim of the apoplexy that had stolen his faculties, rose before her. No, that was impossible. Blame him? The man now lay like a fallen oak, his mind extinguished, without a flicker of hope for recovery. The very idea was monstrous. But what if the pressure, the constant friction, the unspoken resentments that simmered between her parents had somehow been the catalyst? What if the sheer, unremitting tension of their married life, the clashing personalities and differing intellects, had worn him down, leaving him vulnerable to such a devastating blow? The notion was tenuous, a desperate grasping at straws. As far as she knew, such domestic discord and a stroke were uncorrelated, yet the question lingered, insidious and unwelcome. And then, the ultimate question, the one that clawed at the edges of her sanity, surfaced with a terrifying clarity. Why had this happened? Why had God, in his infinite wisdom or his unfathomable cruelty, allowed such a loss and such ruin to descend upon their family? The comfortable, predictable world of Longbourn, the world of garden parties and polite society, had been shattered into a million sharp pieces, leaving them exposed to the biting winds of poverty and disgrace. The whispers of piety that had always soothed her, the comforting assurances of a just and benevolent deity, now felt like hollow mockeries. A profound guttural anger began to bubble up, a forbidden emotion that tightened her throat and made her breath catch. She looked up at the ceiling as if expecting an answer, but only the oppressive silence of the room responded. The anger solidified, hardening into something cold and sharp. Towards God, she felt a dangerous flicker of resentment, a nascent hatred that frightened her even as it offered a strange, perverse solace. If there was no one else, no one tangible to hold responsible, then perhaps, just perhaps, the blame lay with the heavens themselves. And with that thought, a tempest brewed within Elizabeth Bennet, a storm of fury and disillusionment waiting to break. Chapter 6. Next day, the parson of Meryton arrived to offer his formal condolences. He was a man of earnest disposition, whose sincerity transcended the usual formality of neighborly duty. He found Elizabeth in the withdrawing room, attempting to restore a semblance of order to the scattered sewing basket, though her hands moved mechanically. Her usual quickness of spirit was quenched, replaced by a grim clarity. "Miss Elizabeth," the parson began, his voice soft, "I am profoundly sorry for the trial upon your family." Elizabeth stopped, a spool of thread slipping from her fingers. She did not look at him, but fixed her gaze on the dusty windowpane. "A trial?" she echoed, a brittle edge in the word. "Sir, I confess I can see no merit in an ordeal which strips a man of his faculties and leaves innocent women dependent and fearful. If this is a trial, I find the intent to be cruel." The parson sat down near the cold grate. He recognized the tone. It was the sound of a good soul wrestling with a terrible injustice, and in that wrestling, turning its fury upon the divine. "You are angry with God, Miss Elizabeth," he stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, grave fact. "I am angry with the design of the world," she retorted. "If the world is governed by a benevolent hand, why does it feel so utterly arbitrary? Why is suffering dealt out without rhyme or reason? The parson sighed, leaning forward. Then we must speak not of your grief, which is valid, but of your confusion, which is perilous. You believe God is the author of this stroke, this fear, this sudden vulnerability. But I must assure you, Miss Elizabeth, that God is good, and no bad thing, no brokenness, flows from his hand. Elizabeth turned, her face alight with skeptical challenge. Then who is the author? Chance? Fate? Such words are cold comfort, sir. The author is ourselves, or rather, the consequence of a choice made long ago, the parson explained, his voice taking on the earnest rhythm of instruction. He paused, gathering his thoughts, seeking the clearest analogy. When the Lord God first created man and his wife, he did not retain the management of this world unto himself. He delegated. He conferred authority. We read in Genesis that man was to have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth. The responsibility for the beautiful regiment of the earth was transferred to mankind. Elizabeth frowned, puzzled. I understand we are responsible for our actions, but surely God retains the ultimate authority? He retains the ultimate ownership, yes, the parson corrected kindly. But he honored the trust he placed in man. He did not take back the keys to the stewardship simply because man, shortly thereafter, chose to reign without his counsel. Mankind sought autonomous rule, desiring to be sovereign without the sovereign, and mankind failed tragically and utterly, leaving the estate of the world tarnished and broken. He gestured around the room, which felt too large and too quiet now. The world you see now, Miss Bennet, is not governed by God's active cruelty, but by the systemic failure inherited from that initial mistake. It is a broken world, and in a broken system, bad things just happen. The innocent suffer alongside the culpable. The apoplexy strikes the good man. The crops fail the diligent farmer. Misjudgment destroys the fortune. It is the natural chaos of a house whose rightful steward has been locked out, and whose designated managers are incompetent and selfish. Elizabeth settled slowly into a chair opposite him, the theological clarity cutting through the haze of her personal anger. It was a terrifying thought, that the world's suffering was not a policy dictated from above, but a disaster maintained from below. And how, if the authority was given away, could it ever be reclaimed? She asked, the question laced with the urgency of her hope. Ah, now we approach the true intervention of Providence, the parson murmured, his face alight with reverence. God, unwilling to see his creation utterly ruined, intervened. He sent the most precious part of himself, his son Jesus. He was born as a perfect man, the only one since Eden capable of fulfilling the original design of stewardship. Elizabeth listened intently. By his life, death, and resurrection, Christ claimed that dominion back. He paid the price for the original error and demonstrated the perfect regimen of man under God. The supreme authority over all the earth, once foolishly surrendered by Adam, has now been restored, redeemed, into the hands of the perfect man. He paused, letting the magnitude of the declaration settle. But here is the delicate mystery, Miss Elizabeth. Though the authority has been legally claimed by Christ, he has not yet taken up the full, final scepter of earthly rule. We are in a unique interval. We call it the time of grace. He waits for the final day when he will purge the world entirely of brokenness and establish his kingdom universally and forcibly. Why wait? She whispered. Why not reign now and stop this suffering? Because he desires that the acceptance of his regiment be personal and voluntary, the parson replied, his eyes filled with profound sympathy. The final universal restoration is coming. But until then, he offers a new path for us now, a personal submission to his good rule. We are invited, even in this chaos, to step out of the broken system and enter into his kingdom here and now. He offered her a small, hopeful smile. Your father's calamity, Miss Elizabeth, is not a sign of God's vengeance, but a demonstration of the broken system under which we all unfortunately reside. But even as the storm surrounds us, Christ offers you a quiet, safe refuge within his restored authority. You may choose to trust that the new good manager has already been named and that his ultimate plan is restoration, not retribution. Elizabeth looked away from the window and directly at the parson. The burden did not vanish entirely, but the quality of her suffering changed. The sharp edge of moral outrage against God softened into a realization of tragic consequence. She saw that her anger was correctly aimed at the chaos of the world, but wrongly aimed at the source of goodness itself. "I thank you, sir," she said, her voice steadier than it had been all morning. "It is a heavy truth, but perhaps less heavy than the one I had constructed in my own mind." The parson rose. "May the knowledge of his coming perfect reign strengthen your heart in this present darkness, Miss Bennet. You need only accept the good rule he offers, even while patiently awaiting the day when all of Meryton and all the world must submit to it." Chapter 7. The parlor at the parsonage was quiet, the afternoon light thin and cool against the polished mahogany. Elizabeth sat opposite the parson, her posture rigid, though her gaze was reflective. The conversation had drifted from the earthly tragedy of her father's severe apoplexy into the far more unsettling domain of divine justice and human suffering. "But if this world is now a broken world," Elizabeth resumed, her voice low with the weight of her previous arguments, "and if that ancient pronouncement holds, that God transferred the dominion over the earth to the mankind, then we are left in a terrible paradox. He respects his word and does not intervene to fix the broken system which we, through our own nature, perpetuate. We are abandoned to our consequence, sir." The parson, a man whose quiet learning belied the usual expectations set by his profession in Meryton, steepled his fingers, considering her dark conclusion. "Abandoned, Miss Elizabeth? No. That is where your logic, though sound in its initial premise, lacks its final, crucial step." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "It is true. He will not routinely override the covenant of dominion. He will not treat us as automatons whose faulty mechanisms must be seized and corrected against our will. But the covenant of dominion is not a bond of permanent silence. Even when God respects the natural law and the freedom he granted, he still intervenes." Elizabeth's sharp mind seized upon the distinction. "When? How, if not through unilateral action?" "When someone asks for it," the parson replied simply. "That action, Miss Elizabeth, is called prayer." A small, frustrated sound escaped her. "But, sir, we all pray. Mrs. Long prays for rain. My mother prays for a gentleman of 5,000 a year for Jane, and I now pray desperately for my father's recovery. Yet the world remains chaotic, and suffering seems deaf to our pleas. Because it is not merely the act of asking, but the manner of asking that necessitates the response," the parson corrected gently. "Intervention requires a channel of authority. Since the authority for this dominion rests upon human shoulders, God's action must be anchored by human faith. Your prayer must correspond to your faith." Elizabeth frowned, a classic Bennet expression of intellectual challenge settling upon her face. "And what precisely is this faith? Is it merely strong wishing or resolute determination?" "It is neither," the parson stated firmly. "Faith is not a mental thing. It is not a current of thought which can be disciplined and directed solely by the will of the mind. That is mere positive thinking, a human contrivance. True faith, the kind that God honors and responds to, is the assurance of the heart. It is the conviction, deep within one's spirit, that something is already settled in the divine realm, even if the eyes do not yet behold it in the earthly." He paused to allow the weight of the definition to settle. We must not ask God to do something which we, in the deepest part of our being, know to be outside of our present spiritual conviction. To pray without assurance is to attempt to manipulate God. It is presumptuous. We must first identify what our heart truly knows to be achievable, what grace we can genuinely hold conviction for. The room fell silent. Elizabeth looked away from the parson, her gaze fixed on the pane of glass, where a weak sun attempted to pierce the clouds. She thought of her father, the heavy, inert weight of his illness, the terrible uncertainty of his future. Could she genuinely pray for a full, instant recovery? Her honest intellectual heart whispered no, that would be an act of wishful thinking. Her mind could not grasp that assurance. "Tell me, Miss Elizabeth," the parson prompted softly, "if you were to search your heart now, faced with the immediate necessity of your father's distress, what is the action, the relief, the specific intervention for which you possess actual deep assurance? What do you have faith for?" Elizabeth sat for a long moment, wrestling with the question. She could not force the assurance of a complete cure, but her mind, ever pragmatic and loving, sought solutions, aid, and clarity in the terrible fog of their situation. Finally, she looked up, her expression settling into a rare, hopeful resolve. "I do not have the faith yet to pray for his instant and complete return to health, sir," she admitted, "but I have the assurance, the conviction of the heart, that God is merciful and that we are not meant to face this trial alone without guidance." She inhaled deeply, formulating the petition clearly. "Maybe we should pray to God that we would be given clear, specific advice and help, that Providence would send us practical means, knowledge, or assistance, which would support at least some kind of recovery for Mr. Bennet. I have no faith in the miracle itself, but in the tools to pursue it." The parson smiled, a deep, satisfied gesture that warmed his eyes. "That is faith, Miss Elizabeth. It is practical, anchored in conviction, and focused not on the impossible, but on the achievable grace needed to move forward. Let us pray for that." He rose, indicating a place on the rug before the cold hearth. Elizabeth knelt beside him. For the first time since her father had been struck down, the act of prayer felt less like an appeal to an indifferent heaven, and more like reaching for a hand that had always been waiting to be grasped. They began, asking for the clarity and aid needed to navigate in the broken world. Chapter 8. The next day, a carriage, sleek and unmistakably expensive, drew up to their modest door. Before the family could even begin to speculate, the formidable figure of Mr. Darcy entered, his presence immediately dominating the room. His gaze, usually so proud and distant, held an unusual intensity, a discernible hint of concern. But it was not Mr. Darcy alone who caused the Bennet ladies' jaws to drop, Elizabeth included. Following closely behind him was a man of distinguished appearance, his countenance grave but reassuring, carrying a leather bag. "I beg your pardon for this intrusion, ladies," Mr. Darcy began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "but I took the liberty of dispatching a message last night. This is Dr. Ainsworth, a specialist in matters of apoplexy from London. I trust he will be of assistance." A collective gasp, quickly stifled, passed through the room. Mrs. Bennet, momentarily forgetting her own distress, stared at Mr. Darcy as if he had conjured the man from thin air. Jane's soft eyes widened in surprise, while Kitty and Lydia merely gaped. Elizabeth, though still reeling from the shock of his presence, felt a flicker of something akin to gratitude, battling her customary wariness. Dr. Ainsworth offered a polite professional nod, his eyes swiftly assessing the anxious faces before him. "If you would lead the way, ma'am," he addressed Mrs. Bennet, who, flustered but spurred by hope, hastily complied. The next 20 minutes stretched into an eternity. The family gathered downstairs, listening to the muffled sounds from overhead, each tick of the grandfather clock magnifying their anxiety. Finally, Dr. Ainsworth descended, followed by a somewhat less stern-faced Mr. Darcy. The doctor's expression, though still serious, had lost the initial grimness, replaced by a quiet professionalism. "Ladies," he began, his voice calm and clear, "I have examined Mr. Bennet, and I am pleased to report that the situation, while serious, is not as dire as the symptoms might first have suggested." A collective sigh of relief, almost imperceptible, swept through the room. Elizabeth felt a knot in her chest begin to loosen. "He has already regained some degree of consciousness," Dr. Ainsworth continued, as if reciting a list of welcome facts. "He responded to my voice, albeit faintly, and his gaze, though somewhat unfocused, followed my movements. Furthermore, his right side, while weakened, does not appear to be wholly paralyzed. There is some residual movement, which is a very positive sign," warned Mrs. Bennet, clutching a handkerchief to her chest. let out a small, hopeful whimper. Most importantly, the doctor impressed upon them, his eyes were not affected. This suggests to me that the stroke was not due to a cerebral hemorrhage, a bleeding into the brain, which is often far more dangerous, but rather by a blood clot, a thrombosis, which I believe has already begun to dissolve, or indeed largely dissolved itself. It was as if a great weight had been lifted. The terrifying specter of immediate, irreversible decline receded, replaced by a fragile but tangible hope. Dr. Ainsworth then turned to the practicalities of recovery. To prevent such incidents in the future, it is paramount that Mr. Bennet drinks enough water. Dehydration can contribute to blood viscosity and clot formation. Secondly, his recovery will be significantly aided by the support of physical, occupational, and speech therapists. They will help him regain his strength, relearn fine motor skills, and overcome any difficulties with communication. He paused, glancing around at the family. Beyond the medical and therapeutic, however, his emotional and social well-being are crucial. He must enjoy good social contacts with his family. Your conversations, your presence, will be vital for his spirits and cognitive function. Lastly, he should stay as physically active as possible, within the limits of his comfort and safety. Gentle walks, once he is able, will be beneficial. The room was filled with a chorus of grateful murmurs. Elizabeth's eyes, bright with relief, met Mr. Darcy's across the room. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, his expression softening just a fraction. This unexpected act of kindness, this timely intervention, revealed a depth of character she had barely dared to imagine. Mrs. Bennet, ever one to count her blessings, and sometimes hers alone, was already planning. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet, we shall have him drink gallons of water, and therapists. From London, perhaps? Oh, this is a miracle, a blessed miracle." Jane, ever the gentle soul, quietly thanked Dr. Ainsworth, her relief palpable. Even Kitty and Lydia seemed subdued by the good news, their usual frivolity replaced by a sense of hopeful quiet. As Dr. Ainsworth prepared to depart, Mr. Darcy stepped forward. "I have already arranged for a carriage to bring the necessary therapist from a trusted establishment in London. They can be here within the week, as soon as Mr. Bennet is stable enough for their work." Elizabeth watched him, a profound sense of gratitude mixed with wonder swirling within her. The man she had once so fiercely misjudged had now, it seemed, offered a lifeline to her father. The gray morning had given way to a glimmer of sunshine, and Longbourn, though still recovering from its fright, now faced the future with renewed, cautious optimism, all thanks to the most unlikely of benefactors. The path to recovery would be long, but for the first time in days, it was a path they could see. Chapter 9. The hushed quiet of Longbourn, once punctuated by Mrs. Bennet's boisterous pronouncements and Mr. Bennet's wry observations, now felt heavy with a different kind of stillness. Mr. Bennet's stroke had cast a long shadow, and the days that followed were a blur of anxious doctors, hushed consultations, and the ever-present worry of burgeoning medical bills. That afternoon, after the particularly encouraging session with Mr. Bennet's specialist doctor, Mrs. Bennet, emboldened by a glimmer of hope and a profound sense of indebtedness, cornered Mr. Darcy in the drawing room. The air was thick with the scent of wilting roses, a reflection, perhaps, of the family's current mood. "Mr. Darcy," she began, her voice trembling slightly. A rare occurrence for her. She wrung her hands, her gaze darting between him and the portrait of her husband above the mantelpiece. We are so incredibly grateful for your immense generosity. This specialist, the therapist, they are all so far beyond our current means. Pray tell, sir," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "how much do we now owe you? We must know so we can begin to plan, to somehow repay you." Mr. Darcy met her gaze, his own usually reserved expression softened by a genuine compassion. He had been privy to the financial strain Mr. Bennet's illness had imposed, the worried whispers between Elizabeth and Jane, the palpable anxiety that lay beneath the surface of their forced composure. "Mrs. Bennet," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble, I am aware of the considerable financial burdens that Mr. Bennet's illness has brought upon this household. Therefore, he paused, his gaze unwavering. My heart would not permit me to charge a single penny from any of you. Mrs. Bennet blinked, clearly taken aback. But how can that be, sir? Such care is not inexpensive. It was Elizabeth, who had entered the room quietly and stood by the doorway, listening, who finally voiced the question that was undoubtedly echoing in her mother's mind, though she phrased it with her characteristic directness. Mr. Darcy, she asked, her voice clear and steady, why would you do something so extraordinarily generous? We are not so closely connected that such a burden should fall upon you. Darcy turned his attention to Elizabeth, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He met her inquisitive gaze, the spark of her intelligence and her resilience having always held a particular fascination for him. Elizabeth, he said simply, his tone earnest, I could not ignore a family in need. I simply could not. He hesitated for a moment, then added as if an afterthought, his gaze sweeping over the room, encompassing all of them. And by the way, you will be pleased to know that Mr. Bingley will be returning to Netherfield Park within a couple of days. He is most concerned about Mr. Bennet's health, and I have spoken with him. He too will do everything in his power to support the Bennet family during this trying time. A wave of relief, mingled with renewed gratitude, washed over Mrs. Bennet. Elizabeth, though still grappling with Darcy's profound kindness, felt a flicker of something akin to hope. The shadow over Longbourn remained, but perhaps with the quiet strength of Mr. Darcy and the returning warmth of Mr. Bingley, it would not be quite so dark after all. Chapter 10. The coming weeks testified to a slow but constant recovery of Mr. Bennet. The illness had been severe, leaving him frail and confined initially. Now he could already take some short walks around his room, leaning heavily upon a sturdy mahogany cane, and the traces of paralysis that had marred the corner of his mouth and dulled the sparkle in his eye began to vanish, allowing a flickering return of his characteristic dry wit. Netherfield was never quiet, but its atmosphere had transformed from one of frivolous gaiety to one of quiet, invaluable service. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley supported the family in every possible way. Mr. Bingley, with his inexhaustible good nature, provided the essential cheer that kept Mrs. Bennet from succumbing entirely to the vapors, engaging Kitty and Mary in conversation, and ensuring that necessary household details were handled with a smile. Mr. Darcy's assistance was of a more substantial, less visible kind. He consulted with the steward, discreetly settling outstanding bills associated with the crisis, ensuring that the necessary quiet and comfort for Mr. Bennet's recovery were not hampered by practical scarcity. He sat with Elizabeth in the evenings, discussing estate business or occasionally reading aloud, their conversations now marked by a deep, mutual respect that transcended their former animosity. Elizabeth had grown fond of him through these preceding events. Her initial fierce prejudice had been utterly dismantled by the revelation of his profound honesty, his tireless intervention, and his current steadfast silent kindness. Watching him interact with her father, always gentle, always solicitous, yet never condescending, she saw not the proud man of Pemberley, but the devoted protector of his friends and the quiet benefactor of her family. The gratitude that swelled within her transformed slowly, irrevocably, into affection. One afternoon, late in the month, Mr. Darcy called alone. Mr. Bennet had just retired for his rest, and Mrs. Bennet was occupied detailing the virtues of her eldest daughter's impending marriage to a sympathetic Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth found herself alone with Mr. Darcy in the small, comfortable morning room. A heavy silence fell after they had discussed the positive findings of the physician. Darcy stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the winter bare garden, his hands clasped behind his back. He seemed more nervous than she had ever seen him, yet utterly determined. "Miss Bennet," he began, turning to face her, his voice low and firm, "there is a subject I must address that is not related to your father's health, though it is inextricably linked with my own hopes for my future felicity." Elizabeth felt her heart quicken. She knew this moment was coming. sensing the shift in their shared atmosphere over the last 10 days, yet the stark formality of his address stole her breath. "I know," he continued, taking a step toward her, "that I have committed grievous errors in the past, both in the manner of my first address to you and in my behavior. I trust that my actions since have served as a truer representation of my character than my pride allowed me to display previously." He paused, letting his gaze meet hers, searching for any sign of repulsion or doubt. "The weeks we have spent under this roof, united by concern for Mr. Bennet, have been the most illuminating of my life. I have seen your patience, your strength, and your devotion. I have learned the gravity of true affection, and I have found that my respect and attachment for you have only grown deeper and more immutable." He took another, final step, halting close enough that she had to tilt her chin slightly to meet his eyes. "Elizabeth," he said, using her Christian name for the first time, a sound that made her shiver slightly. "I do not wish to rush you, nor to presume upon the kindness you have shown me, but I can no longer bear to remain in this ambiguous position. I would like to begin officially courting you, with the hope that, in time, my devotion may lead to the honor of your hand in marriage." He watched her, the weight of his previous rejection evident in the careful humility of his posture. Elizabeth felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. There was no anger, no hesitation, only clarity and warmth. She recalled the night she had learned of his sacrifice in London, the day she had seen the respect in his eyes as he spoke to her father, and the joy of knowing that she had judged him completely wrong. Elizabeth thought of the words of the parson about the question of responsibility with gratitude, and Darcy had voluntarily taken responsibility for her family and their calamity. That had shown so much good in his character. She did not allow him to remain in suspense for long. A gentle, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile that was both grateful and deeply affectionate. "Mr. Darcy," she replied softly, her voice steady, "your recent conduct requires no future demonstration of your character. I can see your heart clearly now, and I find it to be everything I could ever desire in a companion." She extended her hand towards him, a simple, open gesture of acceptance. "I gratefully accept your offer to begin a courtship, sir. I have every hope that it will lead precisely where you wish it to go." Darcy's relief was immediate and overwhelmingly potent. He took her hand not with the courtly, distant bow of society, but bringing it respectfully to his lips, his eyes shining with an intensity that told her more clearly than any words how much this acceptance meant. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "you have made me the happiest of men." The courtship, formally begun that tranquil afternoon, was already half won. They stood for a moment longer, holding hands, no longer merely allies in a crisis, but two people bound by the promises of a future earned through mutual respect and painful yet necessary self-discovery.